Oh, and one last. Go live. It should go live now. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are joining across the world. First of all, today is super exciting for me personally because product and product operations is one of the things that is very close to me personally. And Antonia, thanks for coming in today, right? Super excited about, I think, what you are doing, and then the insights that we together will provide today for all the audience. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Just as an introduction, Product 10X, I'm Suresh Madhvarsu, managing partner of Product 10X. What we do is really bring in startups. We mentor, advise, coach them to really go from pre-seed, seed to Series A. That's really who we are. And then, of course, as part of what we do, product-led growth, and then product focus is very core tenets of our own acceleration program. So with that in the context, Antonia, I know you've been a product management, product ops leader for a long time. I would love to get some sense of, I think, what led you to here, and then if you can briefly introduce, that'll be super helpful.
Of course. Yes. So as you mentioned, I am a product ops consultant and coach at the moment. My journey here was very nonlinear. So I actually studied English literature and journalism, so nothing to do with tech at all. Back then, I didn't even know what product management was or that it existed. I kind of fell into it. I fell into tech by way of being a games tester. So I was working in Edinburgh at the time at Rockstar Games. That was my first sort of official tech job. Eventually, I moved to Berlin. I started working with more and more startups, specifically to set up QA processes, right? Eventually, again, I realized this product thing is really cool. I would love to go there. So I made that a reality, really loved it. And on one fateful day, I found a job description for something called product operations. Never heard of the term before. Didn't know what it was, but I read the job description and I realized this is everything that I love doing. And this is actually everything that I already do. So I did get that job, and the rest is history.
That's amazing. I know previously, I think you and I discussed a little bit about, I think our own journeys on product leadership roles and all that. So I'll tell you, I think when I came into the Silicon Valley, I mean, probably about 16 years ago, product management was there for sure. I think big companies, especially in the Valley, the likes of HP, Intel, I think the product management is really the core part of it. But then for a lot of the cloud companies, the SaaS companies, now I think it is completely a different one, right? When you talk about product management, product operations, you have the product management analytics, product management databases, product management front end. I think it has now become so segmented and fragmented in a way. I think it's really difficult for somebody to fathom what does it really mean by product management anymore, right? But at the same time, you and I also discussed, I think there is a lot of product operations roles that have come in the last 5 years, especially. And if so, I'm super interested in how do you differentiate product management and product operations in general?
Yeah. So the interesting thing there is that product operations tasks have always existed, right? But different people historically picked them up. Sometimes it was individual PMs, sometimes it was the product leadership, sometimes nobody would do them, right? But they always kind of needed to get done. With product ops as a role becoming more and more visible, what we've done is we've essentially bundled all of those different tasks into one specific person, into one specific role or team, right? So the difference is that a product ops manager doesn't really help to define or build features or products in a way that traditionally a PM would. However, that facilitation of good product work that's their product, right? That's the core of what they do. So a product ops manager's product is essentially the product organization, the product team. Other PMs are essentially their users.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, Antonia, the way, for example, based on organization, I'm sure I think even within the product management org, I think there are different roles per se. But then some of the product orgs that we saw, they have product owner roles, outbound product manager, inbound product manager, and all that. Is it fair to say that a lot of the product ops might be slightly similar to the product owner role? And how do you kind of, if somebody is in the product owner roles today, how do you kind of really compare and contrast what they do versus the product ops?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question to answer because even what a product owner is can be so different at every single company, right? Like, especially here in Germany, I've seen companies that had exclusively product managers, exclusively product owners. They had a mix of product owners and product managers. But even there, some companies have 3 product managers reporting into 1 product owner. Some companies have 3 product owners reporting into a product manager, right? So the terms, they almost don't mean anything anymore. And while it's true that product ops aims to facilitate, day-to-day operational work, I think the important distinction is that product ops managers themselves aren't typically the people doing that work, right? So while we can help facilitate, like basic stuff, like what's the template for how we write user stories? When a feature is complete, how do we deploy it to production? What's the process for setting up an A/B test, right? Those are things that a product ops manager can help define and operationalize so that it's repeatable, it's easy to understand, it's comparable across the board. But ultimately, the product ops manager isn't doing that work themselves. They are helping other people do that work better.
Gotcha. That's super helpful. So just as a kind of, if we take a step back, I remember 20 years back when I was an engineer, there is nothing like DevOps per se, right? About 15 years back. So, which basically means, you are doing your integration scripts, you are building your own connections, and you are doing the release management, you are doing the QA, and that was just fine. But it is just that sometimes when you really focus on, as a engineer developer, I'm supposed to churn out the features, but then there are also these additional administrative items that I need to do. You did it because you have to, but then when DevOps came in, I think, that definitely kind of created a little bit of help to the engineering teams to say, yes, you guys focus on the feature innovation, feature development, while the DevOps and the release management teams will provide that support to you guys. And in the same way, I would imagine from the product management aspect of it as well, yes, while you guys are really doing the product innovation, feature innovation angle, the product ops will provide you help in whatever is needed at that point.
Exactly.
Is that a fair thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I like the analogy of thinking about it like a kitchen, right? And you can make, like, it's one of the example I use in one of my talks. It's like, you can work in a really dirty kitchen and, you forgot to defrost your chicken breast. Your lettuce is kind of wilted. You bought the wrong yogurt for the sauce, but you still kind of get the salad. At the end of the day, you still eat. But with product ops, you might have a lovely fresh chicken breast that was never frozen to begin with. You might have the correct ingredients that have been bought, and they're organic and fantastic. And at the end of the day, each kitchen will have created the same meal, right? But the quality of one of them is much, much higher. And I think that's what really product ops is there to do.
Absolutely. So this is where I want to lead into, I think, what you are specifically doing, by the way, Antonia.
Yeah.
So you've been a kind of, strong advocate of the product ops in general. I think, in the everywhere, I mean, you've been an influential person in that category, to say. What really led you to kind of, really go behind the product ops? And why do you think it is important for companies to recognize that product ops is one of the pillars that they should be thinking about if they want to scale their product operations?
Yeah, I think it's just really, really personal to me, actually. Like, I see great validity in the role itself, and I believe in what it's there to do. Like, I've seen it transform companies and product teams and the way they work. But ultimately, I think the reason why I'm such a strong advocate for it is because I know people who are struggling. They are struggling through their day-to-day work. I have been that person who was struggling, right? Who desperately needed support, who felt like she couldn't really do her job the right way because of all this sort of day-to-day overhead, because every time there was a planning cycle, we needed to figure out all over again how to do planning, right? I was that person. So I think in some ways, apart from the fact that I truly believe it can make a difference, it's also a little bit because I just genuinely, if I can prevent somebody from having that bad experience, and if I can enable them to really unleash their fullest potential, then I would love to be in that position. And I think that's what really drives me.
That's amazing. So I'll tell you, I think, to bring, I think, what you are doing, what we are doing in the context of the startups.
Yes.
The one question that I have is, as you can imagine, startups are really kind of trying to, there are several categories for sure, but then some are surviving, some are thriving, some are kind of really seeing how do we kind of make our own dent in this universe.
Yeah.
And for startups of the super early stage, let's say seed, Series A, and probably pre-series may not really make sense, but I would really think of the seed and the Series A plus. How do they, and how should they be thinking about the product operations in general?
Yeah, so I think, listen, I'm not going to come here and advocate that a company of 10 people needs a full-time product ops manager, right? I don't think that is necessary, actually. The thing that I would really love for more startups to think about is whether they are being deliberate, right? Because I've seen a lot of startups go from this, hey, we are small, we're a scrappy team, we just get stuff done and it works, to then going into a growth stage, hiring more and more people, and all of a sudden, everything is broken. Nothing works because things were implicit, because processes either didn't really exist or they were just like, it was a common understanding. And that works up until a certain size, right? But even there, it's really about being deliberate with your choice of tools, with your choice of measuring or goal setting, right? It's not about introducing processes when you're 3 people and really all you need to do is talk to each other, right? I'm not here to overcomplicate anyone's life, but it's really just about taking a step back and really thinking about how the choices that we make today will affect us in the future. Yeah. Because the thing is, it's incredibly hard to come back from this kind of dysfunction, right? You can do it, but it needs a really, really concentrated effort to, let's say, if you're a company of 300 people and you realize, shit, none of our tools are speaking to each other, or we have no way to close the feedback loop. You know, we get feedback from customers in 14 different places, and it just disappears into the ether. You can fix it at that point, but it is much more helpful to the business and to the people working in the business if you start thinking about that from the get-go.
Right. So that's a great point that you made, because especially for many of the startups, they either start with a great set of engineers, and then engineering is the one that is driving the whole feature roadmap and prioritization, everything. I mean, again, by the way, in many cases that works, because when you are 2-3 people and then you're really validating the product, that's really very important to have the agility at that point of time.
Absolutely.
But then once you have a couple of customers, now somebody is paying, and now it is really the time for you to hone in, are we producing the right set of features? I mean, do we have the right infrastructure to release these features on a continuous basis? Because it can't be like, one day we release something on Monday, the next week we release something on Friday, and then everything is broken, and then people can't log in on Monday morning. And again, those are the things that we all struggle, right? I mean, as much as we're in 2023, these problems still exist, unfortunately. And if so, I think it's very common for us to have these product management consultants, somebody coming in, looking at, hey, as a kind of, take a step back and then see who is doing what is your prioritization. Yeah, sure. I mean, you may not really have the tools, you may not have the sophisticated way of doing things, but do you at least have something in your spreadsheet?
Right.
What do you, how do you say next week, these are the 3 features that we are working? Who is giving you that direction? Is it coming from your founder, somebody looking into the customer, all that? So in a similar way, I think, what I'm hearing from you is product ops also can bring in a lot of the structure during the initial time frame when you have the right consultant at that point of time. I mean, to your point, I mean, definitely, of course, you may not need a full-time person.
Sure.
But having somebody who can kind of, really look at it and say, hey, I can help you. I may not be able to help you, but if I can help you, these are the probably small things that you want to really consider as part of your daily process. So now coming back to that segment, I know you've been a co-author of the product operations manifesto in a way. And what principles from there can we take and apply to startups?
So I actually have the principles right here, and I would just love to read them out, because it's 4 principles that are part of the Product Ops Manifesto. And I actually talked about the manifesto at a conference in June called Product at Heart. And in that talk, I said, these principles almost seem not worth saying out loud, because it's like you read them, it's like, but isn't this obvious? Like, isn't this common sense? Like, of course, you would do these. But that's exactly the point. The fact that they are so quote unquote common sense is why we need to remind ourselves and keep reminding ourselves to do them. And they're applicable to so much more than just product operations, right? So it's flexibility over uniformity. It's open collaboration over functional separation, short iteration cycles over long-term plans, and depth of impact over breadth. And really, if you read those in the context of startups, that's really the bread and butter of what a startup is supposed to be doing, right? It is that innate agility, that flexibility to respond to whatever external factors. It is that, the actual, really the essence of what it means to be a startup and to create a business from nothing, from scratch. And I think the wonderful thing about product ops is that the core component is to make that agility work for everybody, right? For the business, for the people inside of the business, and for the customers, actually, at the end of the day. So I think this is why I always a little part of me just dies every time somebody tells me, oh, okay, but product operations, it's really only something for like large corporations. And of course, in a company of 1,000+ people, you have much more of these tasks that need to be managed. So it might be a much easier way of saying, right, we will invest in a product ops team or a product ops person, right? There might be an easier case to be made in large corporations like that. But the startup stage, I mean, that's the birth of your company. That's where you will start creating the company culture that might actually make or break you further down the line, right? That's where the companies that just get work done somehow by pure coincidence will always struggle compared to the companies that are deliberate in their choices. And I think that's why it's such a beautiful marriage, actually.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I think, this really actually brings home the point, right? Which is, I love the third and fourth points that you just mentioned, by the way.
Yeah.
The shorter iteration cycles and the depth
Yeah.
of feature.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons, because a lot of times when as product management teams or even as founders, when we prioritize features, it is super easy to say, oh, you know what, in the name of the MVP or in the name of the proof of concept, just do something minimal.
Yeah.
Right? Sure, I think, probably for internal proof of concepts, that's perfectly fine. But if you want to ship that feature to a customer, then you no longer have the, I would say, luxury to ship something minimal that doesn't work. Right?
Yes.
When we talk about that, depth of the feature, that's really what it is,
Yeah.
right? I think, I'm sure, there is this very famous graphic that goes around on the MVP as a kind of, as a triangle or a pyramid. And then people think of MVP as just a small slice horizontally.
Yeah.
It's actually a vertical slice where it has to be functioning, it has to be marketable, it has to be sellable at the end of it, right? So that's really where, when we think about that depth of the problem solving, we need to be very conscious of, is this solving a problem, full quote and unquote, right?
Yes.
That's very important for us.
Yeah.
Which is similar to your point, Antonia. I mean, I don't know, almost long time back when Agile Manifesto got released, when you read the Agile Manifesto, it just feels, yeah, I mean, that's common sense, everybody's doing it, but unfortunately, nobody does it, right? And collaboration versus documentation, I think it is probably one of the things that we hear in the Agile Manifesto, which is also like, yeah, I mean, that should be the one. But no, I mean, what people focus so much of, just document the things, but nobody reads the documentation, unfortunately, right? So those are the things, it really resonates when you talked about, product operations. I think we need to really bring home that point of, you need to be really fast in producing these features, because at the end of the day, especially in the startups, you have a hypothesis, you are testing your hypothesis, and you never know, just because as a founder, am I right in that hypothesis? Unless you go to first customer, second customer, third customer, and then go through those iterations of saying, yes, this feature is working, but these are, some exceptions, you need to better handle it. And those are the cases where you want to make sure, yes, while product managers are really focusing on the strategic direction and feature innovation over there, what kind of support does this product management teams need, I think is really where the point of the product ops really comes into the picture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially with startups, and really the smaller or startup you are, you cannot afford to not know what success looks like, right? You cannot afford to not have comparable MVPs or comparable experiments. If you mess up in measuring your A/B test, the last 2-3 weeks of development have just absolutely been wasted, right? They have just gone out of the door. And it's exactly that thing. It's about being deliberate, and it's about having actually the solid base for honestly, it's good business. Like, you are creating something out of nothing. You have, like you say, you have a hypothesis, maybe you have a few, maybe you have an idea of how to solve a perceived problem. But the thing is, you need to measure that. You need to validate that, especially now where it's getting comparatively harder to get funding, right? To get access to pre-seed and series rounds. You need to be able to show that you are bringing tangible value to the market. And I think this really goes beyond just knowing how to formulate a good user story or knowing how and when to deploy, right? It's really, these are actually the basis of what you're building your entire business on.
Completely with you on that. So as part of the manifesto, I think you also talked about the community-driven approach.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what do you mean by that, and then how do you combine community-driven development and innovation with the product ops and startups? How should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, so I think for me, community is just very important, because a lot of the opportunities that came my way, a lot of the learning I did came from being an active member of communities, right? I always say this to people, like, be an active community member, because yes, of course, while the learning you get from talking to somebody with a different experience will be different than from going through that experience yourself, right? But at the end of the day, so I've been speaking to product ops and product people for almost the entirety of the last 3 years, right? And of course, while I myself have a quite varied background and experience, and I have seen and experienced lots of things, I can now tap into this collective intelligence of people that have done things that I haven't done, right? Of course, this only works if the other people are also open and, happy to be collaborative. But I think ultimately there is nothing gained by being secretive or by closing yourself off, right? At the end of the day, we are in this because it's a passion of ours, because we all collectively want to get better at it. And if I will literally talk to anybody that sends me a message on LinkedIn, and that is something that it doesn't really matter how busy I get. That is something that I want to continue doing, because to a certain extent, the people that have done that for me in the past have been instrumental to my growth. But also because sometimes I wish there was somebody that was as open as I am now, right? I wish there was somebody that was actually talking about the difficulties and the challenges and how to overcome those. So community-driven anything, really, to me, can only ever be a value add.
That's amazing that you said that, which is where I think my learning has come from as well, Antonia, because again, 15 years ago, when we talk about the product management, I think there are some books that was written on product management, and especially I think pragmatic marketing, for example, is one of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley's, the poster child of how should you be doing the product management. But other than that, it is not as though that I could have gone to some practitioners and talk to them. I think the concept of communities is thinking in the last 10 years, it is definitely came up to be really well. Now, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, whatever people use, it's very easy to express and talk about, I think, the challenges and solutions. But that's exactly the place, I think, I completely agree with you that community involvement and making sure that you contribute and you learn at the same time. because that's also one part we keep talking about, the growth mindset, right? It doesn't really
Right.
about the technology or whatever, whether in the professional or personal life. It's really about giving, and then also learning as part of the giving. I think is super important that way. Thanks for, I think, really putting that together. By the way, the community development is very important for any product organization in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the fact that we can learn from each other, and it's one of those things, right? Even if you are a senior leader, even if you've been in the business for 20 plus years, you can still learn something from a junior, because you know what, like, you have blinders on, you have been in the industry for 20 plus years. This person is coming into it, looking at it with fresh eyes, and they might have a revelation that you may never have stumbled upon, right? And I think it's also, it goes into being humble as well, and really opening yourself up to the possibilities that exist out there. Yeah.
Completely. So there is a new term, I guess, industry coined for that, Antonia. They are calling it as the reverse learning. And that seems to be really a big thing, because especially the enterprises are now very big on the reverse learning, because of, one, to your point, the age is very different. I mean, some of the leaders are in their 50s, 60s, or whatever, and some of the younger generation, when they come in, they're in early, late 20s. So there is that 30 years of experiential gap in a way.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, it's very different way of doing things, learning things. If so, then the senior leaders are actually kind of, making that happen as a reverse learning practice, so that you talk to the younger employees in that sense, to really understand what does it really mean by work for them.
Yeah.
I mean, how would you prioritize something versus how would I prioritize? Why are you doing that? I mean, just to understand the aspects of the thought and the leadership aspect of it is so beneficial for everybody as such.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think community, especially in a new field like product operations, it also helps us hold each other accountable, right? Because I think to a certain extent, some people feel like we have this reputation of, well, first of all, it's just a trendy thing, it's just a fad, it will go away. But I think the more damaging reputation is the one of like process people. We just come in, we create process upon process, and like we make everything 10 times harder than it needs to be, and it messes everything up. The thing is, I understand where that misconception comes from, because I think not every product ops manager is a good product ops manager. And I think for some, their path may have been just go in, introduce processes, and then leave again, right? But because we are such a strong community, because right now there's still not super many of us, we can hold each other accountable. We can sort of help each other think things through, right? And if somebody asks for help, we help them take a step back and ask, like, well, what are you actually trying to achieve? Like, don't think in process terms, think about the end state. And then if the thing that you need to introduce is a well-structured Excel spreadsheet, then so be it, right? You don't need to spend tens of thousands on fancy new software, but it is only doable by being part of this strong community.
Absolutely. That's amazing to know. So I know because of the startups that we're focusing on, Antonia, let's say there are these startup founders in whatever stage that they are thinking about the product ops, and they want to kind of even at least see what it means for them. Where do you think they should really start? And then what's the framework that you think will help them to understand if product ops is the right thing for the stage that they are in or not?
Yeah. So again, I think product ops is always there, and it just depends on how much you want to focus on it. And it's completely fine, especially if you are, I don't know, pre-seed or pre-series A, to say, look, we just need to churn things out right now. And it doesn't really matter if things are messy. It doesn't really matter if we are consistent in how we write things down, right? It can be dangerous, but if it's a deliberate choice, right, to park this, to think about this later, fair enough. I think where it becomes more and more relevant is really when you start thinking about, okay, how will we hire our first employee? How will we hire our first product manager? How do we know whether they're a good fit? What kind of things are we looking for? And then once we have that employee, how do we make sure that they actually have everything they need to do their job successfully? And this isn't just tools, right? It's also knowledge. It's also access to data. It's also company culture, right? As a company. And especially this becomes so relevant once you start growing. What kind of company do we want to be? How do we as a company want to get work done, right? Is engineering excellence our bread and butter, right? Is customer focus in everything we do our bread and butter? How do we structure these teams that we are now starting to staff? And I think it is really about not getting swept up in the tide and instead making deliberate choices that actually makes the difference.
That's amazing. I know we discussed a lot of topics today, and this has been a great discussion. Before we wrap up, I think there are two questions that came from the audience, by the way, Antonia. So the first one is, if I really decide to have the product ops and I have a couple of people with me who are ready to step in, that can get into that role, what are the process and tools that I should be really thinking through to set that in the motion?
So I don't like recommending tools because I think that always needs to have a discussion around what your end goal is, right? There are certain tools that a lot of us use, like Miro, like Slack and Zoom, right? Whenever work gets done, you always have a tool stack. Whether you've specifically decided on it or not, whether you've decided on it because it is the industry standard or because it's something that really works for you specifically, is debatable. But ultimately, having a tool stack does not have to be expensive, right? Especially with startups, there are a lot of things you can do with free tools, with tools that come with the G Suite, right? Like it doesn't have to be a fancy new road mapping tool. Maybe you just need to get better at structuring your documents, or maybe you just need to get better at, having slides that use the same template through and through so that you have comparable information. So I think for new product ops teams or team members, the most important thing is really figuring out actually this future state, right? And really working together with senior leadership to say, okay, a year from now, what do we want this company to look like, right? And then you work backwards from that. Because based on that desired future state, what do I need to enable right now? Is it more education? Is it a more robust data structure, right? Do we need to get better at figuring out our analytics or tagging things? Do we actually need to invest some tools because the tools that we grew up with no longer fit the bill?
Right.
So I think I would love to have that discussion more than discussion around what tools do we need, because that's always going to be, it depends.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, definitely. That makes sense. And the second question that I have is, so what is the typical collaboration structure that looks like for the product ops? I mean, product ops working with the product management team is clear, but then, who are the other stakeholders that we should be thinking about when we think about the collaboration with product ops teams?
Yeah, so this is very interesting because, again, you can actually customize this quite a lot depending on what your company needs. I've been a product ops manager that serviced product managers specifically and nobody else. I have been in product ops leadership and I took care of the entire R&D department. So it was product engineering, QA, design, etc., because it was a much smaller team. There are pros and cons to each of these approaches. I think it's breadth over depth, right? If you go really deep into the product manager experience, you can get some really amazing things done. The caveat there is that to a certain extent, it doesn't matter how good you are at defining what to build if you can't successfully put it in front of your customers, right? I personally prefer a more holistic approach that really looks at how do we go from ideation to post-launch, right? And how does that entire life cycle work? That's just my personal preference. And I think at an organizational level, I ideally think product operations should report into the CPO, actually, or the product-led founder, What does work well, especially in a more holistic approach, is to kind of have this trio. So you would have the CPO, the CTO, and then the product ops person as a sort of enabler for these two strong mandates.
Gotcha. Yeah. That totally makes sense to me. Again, Anthony, I know we've come to the end of the session, but I would say this. We've discussed multitude of things today, all the way starting from why product ops to, all the best practices. But I think my personal takeaway really is the manifesto. Honestly, I think, at the end of the day, for startup, that's super important, right? To be able to kind of be agile, to really crank things out much faster in a way that you get the feedback much faster as well and actually go deep. I think, that's really the kind of, great outcome for me personally. I'm sure, I think for the viewers out there, they might have got different nuggets out there, but super helpful on what we discussed. And thanks to you in really kind of, really pushing out the passionate enthusiasm for product ops in that sense. And I'm really looking forward for more insights in the future session, by the way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you, Antonia. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.